welcome back to Property Matters on Dublin South FM with myself, Carol Tallon. You can contact us on Twitter at iPropertyRadio or email hello@iPropertyRadio.com. I'm now joined by Dr. Greg Jackson, founder of Autoplan. Greg, you're very welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Carol.
So Autoplan, we were just having a conversation off air, which would really be worthwhile to share. So Autoplan, first of all, you might just tell us what it is and what you do.
Sure, of course. So as you mentioned, I'm the founder and CEO of Autoplan. We're a proptech company based in Ireland. We were founded in March 2020, which is a very interesting time to start any company, particularly a technology startup. We're currently funded by Enterprise Ireland and the NDRC and the European Space Agency. What we do is, I like to say our mission is to make architects' lives easier. If you look at the world of architecture, it's undergone this incredible digital transformation in the past 20 years. But that's been focused on the design side of architecture. So companies obviously spearheaded by companies like Autodesk. But the administrative and reporting side of architecture is very much what I like to say is an analog problem in a digital world. And that's where we've kind of created our technology and platform around trying to solve that problem.
So how did you come to be involved in the digital transformation of the built environment? Do you come from a real estate background?
From my family, yes, actually. So my father was a real estate agent while I was growing up for a number of gun auctioneering franchises. And he's now actually an architect. He retrained himself. So I feel like it's kind of in my blood. Professionally, I've had a pretty varied career, if you were interested in hearing about it.
Please do.
Sure. But it's always been related to smart cities or future cities or built environment sensing and analysis. I started my career in a company called Solarprint here in Ireland, developing power sources for sensors to help us sense our cities and environments. And I worked for Intel Research Labs for a couple of years over in London, working with the Greater London Authority, designing air quality sensors to be deployed in places like Tower Bridge at each end to understand the impact in the environment when the bridge is lifted on the local population. And I've done a PhD in computer science in Imperial College in London as well, in very much in smart future cities. And my last 2 years of that were actually working with the Singaporean government on their smart cities initiative as well. So despite the fact I'm a computer scientist, I would like to think that I have, through osmosis, learned an awful lot about the challenges and problems in the AEC industry throughout the last kind of 15 years or so.
You know, isn't it amazing? It's a little bit like Steve Jobs, his iconic commencement speech at Stanford, where he talked about joining the dots looking backwards and how it's only possible looking backwards. But it's really interesting to see the cross-section of real estate and construction bring in the data, because as you describe on your website, Autoplan is a data company. Whereas in real estate, it has taken the industry a while to understand that actually they too are operating data companies. They just don't know it yet. So in terms of the offering for Autoplan, did that stem out of your experiences working in Singapore? Because obviously we know that, I mentioned to you off air, you know, through my own work with smart cities, we know that you know, Singapore was not taking the lead back in 2014 and 2015. And then by 2017, 18, 19, it had just leapfrogged so many other countries and cities. So how has that shaped or fed into the offering that is now Autoplan?
No, I think it's a really good question. And as you say, it's a testament to the engine that is the Singaporean government. When they put their mind to something, they resource it exceptionally well, and they're able to undertake very rapid change, particularly from a digital perspective. I think we were talking off air. I always give the example that in Singapore, when you submit a planning application, you also submit the BIM files, and they do automated control checking against building controls to see if you're compliant. They're light years ahead. And seeing that system kind of in my mind gives a blueprint of how every system could work. And also, when you see the frustrations of my customers are architects, so you see the frustrations of architects, you can then map where it could be and then see where they are, and then start to progressively, as you say, introduce data into solutions for them to streamline their processes and maybe free up some time for them to do what they love, do more design, or go out and get more business, which I think is the important thing.
I'm I'm glad to hear you use the term mapping out, because in terms of a process, that's what needs to happen. For the last number of years, we know that a number of local authorities, driven by, of course, the new Office of Planning Regulator, has been pushing to digitise elements of the planning process. And one of the things that we found in our own experience is that in trying to digitize one element of it, we come up against a barrier that first needs to be digitized, and that's a real problem. So, in terms of the Singaporean government getting to where they got to, with bin files being actually being received as part of a planning application, does that then mean that the entire industry transformed in a really short period of time? And I mean every working professional.
Yeah, well, you need to react to legislation and the requirements for submission. And I think that that's really important. And I won't discount the work that's happened in Ireland as well from a government perspective. I think last week, Cork County Council announced that they're digitising submissions, and knowing the work that's done with the National Planning Application Database with the Department of Housing is, and from my perspective, having seen internationally some of the work done, Ireland is doing very good work. I think where commercial interventions come in is that the bodies I previously mentioned need to be all things to all people. They're public, they're services for public good, and they're services that need to align with legislation and statutory requirements. And by having to work for everyone, they'll never be tailored specifically to the needs of one use case or one customer. And we're firm believers in Autoplan of design thinking principles and using good, customer-centric design to actually build out products that people need to solve real problems. So very much when I talk about this stuff, it's about making a product that specifically works really well for one type of customer, as opposed to what from the government perspective needs to be done, which is
what they're trying to do.
Exactly.
Okay, and actually it's a good way to introduce new technology by breaking it down into maybe the core elements being designed through design thinking, because that's an approach that is so well accepted now in the construction industry, and it really is considered best practice in terms of any innovation, whether it's technology enabled or not. So, in terms of Autoplan, as I mentioned, you're a data company. Will you break down exactly what the offering for architects is?
Of course, yeah, of course. So we have our first products actually live on our site. We have a beta live, and it's free to use for anyone who'd like to at autoplan.ie. It's a planning history search tool. So in going out and speaking to our customers, the top pain that every customer said back to me was finding the planning history for the site and local precedents is really difficult, particularly for commercial use cases, because if you want to build a factory in Ireland, you need to search 31 different databases to find potential suitable precedents, and they're not all filterable by factories. So we built a planning history search tool on our site that has the entire planning record for the country and is searchable by location and returns things in the way that you would view properties on Daft or myhome.ie. So it just makes it quicker and easier to use, and quicker and easier to find that data and connect architects to the data they need.
Okay, are you tapping into local authorities or a central database?
So we start with the NPAD, with the National Planning Application Database, and we've built AI classification tools then to kind of do our more advanced features, such as filtering by type. So we can, on the site now, where it's actually not live yet, but it'll be coming in the coming months, we're able to filter down and just return apartments or just return small estates, or filter down and just return results that have been accepted strategic housing developments for X in X districts for the current development plan. So you're able to really speciate and find just the relevant precedents for your site. So I would say we started with what would be called open data, but we've since layered on our own kind of proprietary data sources to do more.
Very good. In terms of, you mentioned there open data in terms of the National Planning Database, how complete are you finding that? Because obviously it's come under quite a bit of criticism that there are still PDFs locked away on regional local authorities. So how complete are you finding that?
Yeah, it's what I would call a lossy data set. So it isn't complete. And I think that they know that it isn't complete and there's work that needs to be done. I think good computer science can work around that. We've one of our commercial partners is Google, and they've supplied us with access to kind of Google's Maps APIs, and we use that to backfill in information that isn't there. For some councils, they're missing addresses, so we've had to reverse engineer those to add them in. So there are parts that are missing, and I think if you're rallying together every planning office in Ireland with different requirements and slightly different systems, that's always going to happen. I think that's a natural consequence of aggregating such a massive amount of data. But from our perspective, we aren't terribly worried about that because good computer science can overcome that challenge and complete it. So that's what we've done.
And again, I suppose we're talking about historical data, whereas if we can move to a more automated planning application process, then these issues will rectify themselves, because then we will have a fully digital record. How close are we to that? You know, on your website, you know, you talk about the vision for Autoplan is an automated planning application process. How achievable is that, and in what time frame in Ireland do you think?
Yeah, I think there's, if you look at the kind of Build 2040 work, there's a whole stream for digitising the planning process. So I think the government are putting in place systems and kind of well-funded vehicles to achieve that. And we're seeing between kind of Cork and Dublin City Council that they're, for residential Dublin City Council, you can submit digitally now. So we're starting to see the early adopters adopting, which is fantastic. I do think it is a 5-10 year challenge, and depending on the systems in place in the individual councils, it could take longer or shorter. From our perspective, we're more interested in automating the process to get to the submission rather than automate the submission itself. So I think the government has a pathway towards actually submitting documents digitally, which is fantastic. From our perspective, we're looking to combine all of our individual data sources and products into what we call Autoplan Project, which is a workflow project management tool for the architect that maybe puts their teams on rails, so they understand per type of project what needs to be done when throughout the pre-planning process, and then introduces potential, what you need to know from the local development plan at the appropriate stage, or if you need to do a flooding analysis, it gives you a preview of that, and combines all our data sources into this workflow management tool, which will kind of free up owners of architecture firms to, again, go out and get new business while their employees are working on existing projects.
Okay, and do you envisage that your tool, or maybe it does already, do you plug into existing technologies that are being used and existing design tools that are being used?
Yeah, so I think there's a definite need for a handover at planning submissions. So we're looking at REBA's, I never get this acronym right, the NMS, the sourcing system, as one potential handover point, and then obviously plugging into Revit and other systems for BIM then as well. So that's definitely part of the target for the handover, because we see ourselves only being a pre-planning company rather than a post-planning company. There's lots of really good innovation in the post-planning space, technology-wise. And I could talk all day, but it's maybe not terribly interesting to your audience about the need for schemas and standards in this industry so that we can export data into any platform or program. But I think that might be a different talk for a different day.
Well, the only thing is, it is important that we talk about that now, not necessarily on this call, but I think that's an important conversation for the industry to be having, because this is now the time to do it, as opposed to when people are on different systems then trying to get them to align. So actually, there does need to be a more standardized approach. And you had mentioned some of the provision under Bill 2040, and actually across a number of different verticals, it all comes down to uniformity. So it is a really important one. But I'm conscious the position you're in, particularly as you mentioned, you've come through NDRC, you're supported by Enterprise Ireland, which tells me, I know that you've done a huge amount of customer discovery, probably into triple digits. So that means, so that means you have a good insight into where the industry is now. Because Ireland, it's a small industry. Our architecture firms, there aren't that many of them. And in fact, we're, prior to the crash, we were seeing very large firms. They then broke up, and now we're starting to see these very large firms emerging again. So, in terms of architecture in Ireland, how tech enabled is it, on a global comparison scale?
It's a really good question, and one I'm mulling over as I think. I think we're doing well. I think if you look at any of the larger firms, I did some work with Foster's in the UK back in 5-6 years ago. They were building internal systems to digitize all their processes. And that slowly filtered out into the industry. So whether it be internally in a mid-sized firm, they keep Excel spreadsheets and centralized documentation around planning requirements and kind of local development plan requirements and the areas they generally work. These systems have organically been grown over the past number of years. I think the issue with, I talk a lot about vertical siloed data, about loads of different sources of data that don't talk to each other. And I think that organically building up these platforms internally in Irish architecture firms and European architecture firms, it's a broader issue, is a natural consequence of architects not being computer scientists. It makes sense. It's not, no one would expect them to be, but I think that having startups starting to come into the space now and create these centralized systems that any architecture firm could use will accelerate that digitization and really allow Ireland to be at the forefront of what you're speaking about, rather than kind of being I'd say they're comparable to any other European architecture firm from what I've seen.
That feels like a very diplomatic answer, but I won't press you on it. So no, but for me, it's really important. I think in Ireland we can be prone to hyperbole. Sometimes we think we're a little better than we are, but the reverse is also true. But I think we need to be really honest in terms of our tech adoption and where we're at. And the interesting thing, just at the start of our call, when you talked about maybe motivations that really meant the Singaporean government were able to speed up their process was through legislation. And what we see in Ireland is that and tech enabling legislation tends to follow rather than lead. So we tend for adoption to be industry led rather than led by legislation. And I don't think planning in this industry is really going to be any different. However, and I'm conscious that you said Autoplan is a pre-planning company, but having said that, the motivation exists for all design and planning teams if they know there's a digitized planning process, because you don't just digitize your process in order to submit an application. So that prompts the transformation of all processes before your digital application. So it almost feels like through Autoplan that you're preparing for a transformation that we think is going to happen, that we assume is going to happen to the planning process, rather than the legislation driving it. Is that a fair representation?
I think that's a very fair point. I have a couple of comments on your comment. I think firstly, it's a rising tide scenario. I think that, I think particularly in the last 18 to 24 months, the Irish government has put out a lot of kind of signifiers or goalposts that need to be met, both by local planning offices and by people who submit to local planning offices, whether they be architects or other professionals or individuals. So I think that that's really important. I will always make one comment when we talk about the advances of the Singaporean government is they have the advantage of being very vertically integrated, so they can change very quickly from the top down, which is obviously more difficult in maybe a Western country. So it's always worth noting that when we talk about how quickly they're able to change.
Yeah, and that's a very fair point. Yeah.
So I think so, but in general, I keep coming back to, I would like Autoplan to get to the position where we're not following that tide, but raising that tide and hoping and pushing for others to kind of catch up to it, rather than waiting for the digitization process to happen, as you say, and then responding to it. So as long as we keep being part of the conversation and keep helping inform how these things can change, we'll be in a good position, I think.
That's a really exciting space for a startup to be in, where you're not trying to cater to best practice. You're actually involved in creating what will be best practice. It's a really exciting space. It's a big opportunity as well. I don't like this US narrative of owning a space, but in a small
Mm.
country like Ireland, there is an element of that. So, I understand what you're saying about the rising tide, and that's a very Irish approach to innovation as well. But there's a reason for it. It's what we know works. That's not to say others won't work, but it's what we've seen. It's what we know will work. Um, Before we finish up here today, what's the big picture for Autoplan? Because I appreciate that you've only established in the last 12, 13 months at probably one of the most extraordinarily difficult times, not just in Ireland, but obviously globally. But I'd imagine there are some advantages and some disadvantages to that. But what's the big picture vision? If I was to speak to you in five years' time, what do you think would be happening with the company?
No, I think I have we have that very kind of concretely laid out, and obviously it's subject to change, but we know where we want the company to be. I think a very quickly comment on the challenges of the last year. The last year was a challenge, but it was also an opportunity. And we did speak to, as you say, 100 plus customer discovery. People picked up the phone. They were at home. They were more willing to have a conversation. You didn't have to travel for 2 hours. Zoom-based interactions like the one we're having now were normalized. So actually, that was a benefit to our company. So in a weird way, it kind of worked quite well for us for the stage of company we were at. And they do say the companies that can survive a recession and the companies that survived through the last recession, I always talk about Learn-Upon as one of those, and are now incredibly successful. It's a testament to that if they can survive that, they can survive anything. In terms of our 5-year plan, we've just opened a seed round, so we're raising 700K now to accelerate our growth into the UK and to finalize our platform offering rather than our individual product offerings, and really wrap it up into a service that can work in both the UK and Ireland. And in 5 years, I would like us to move east and start to capture market space in Germany and France and the Netherlands and Scandinavian countries, particularly Denmark.
Is the pre-planning process for architects pretty similar across those jurisdictions?
Parts of it are and parts of it aren't. So for instance, it's much more building control focused in Germany. So a planning history search tool isn't as relevant to them. I call that a trust tool. So it's a tool we give free to our customers to allow them to get to know us and understand us and maybe let us build a bit of credibility and understanding with our marketplace. We need to develop a different tool for the German ecosystem. But thankfully, not for them, but for us. The building control terminologies, rules, and rule sets are they're very diffuse and hard to find and not very easily searchable. So a replacement tool for them could be a Wikipedia for building codes and requirements. So we can swap out individual modular elements of our system and our sales pipeline to work in those ecosystems. Something I haven't touched on terribly as well is our work with the European Space Agency. So we've a 2-year project with the ESA now funded that is letting us explore how their environmental data could be used to streamline planning services, and that has global reach. So those data sources are obviously they're Earth observation based, they're satellite based, so they have the ability to capture that data worldwide. So it allows us
When
to be
you
very
talk about, sorry to cut across you there, but when you talk about environmental data, what are you referring to? Like, are we talking about air quality?
Very much so. Air quality is one of the primary data sources. We have some marine data, we have flooding data, understanding of green spaces. They've different sentinel sources which record different environmental indicators. So our work with them is they're always looking for more commercial outputs for their data sources. That's the reason to exist and the reason they're sensing them, and this reason to make them openly available to the public. So it's a part of our work with the ESA Space Solutions Ireland and Minute and Tyndall is to undertake that work. So we're actually starting with more customer discovery now to understand things like the screening process for environmental impact assessment reports and the air quality impact assessments in the UK, and then how we could potentially streamline or even automate part of that service and create a tool for either environmental consultants or architects to check if they need to do one, or even downstream potentially make the process easier, simpler, and quicker and cheaper. I'm speaking in the abstract because it is a 2-year project and our work is to actually understand the problem first. So again, while I have your audience, if anyone is interested in the topic I've just discussed or would like to reach out and talk about the problems and challenges they have with environmental data in the planning process, please do reach out to Autoplan. We'd love to have a chat with you.
That's a really interesting one. Okay, well, certainly we'll push that out through our social media channels as well, because again, these are conversations that are just starting to happen. There are no experts in this space. So actually there aren't many places to go looking to start solving problems. So absolutely, if we can send the problems your way, that's a good deal for us. Again, the company's at such an exciting stage. I look forward to seeing how it progresses. So thank you so much for joining us today. That was Dr. Greg Jackson, founder of Autoplan. And that's it from us this week. Thank you for listening into Property Matters on Dublin South FM. You can get in touch with the show on social media at iPropertyRadio or by emailing hello@iPropertyRadio.com. Also, my thanks to Peter Rice on sound. We're back at the same time next week. From myself, Carol Tallon, and all the team here. Stay safe.